Neoliberal reforms of anti-poverty policy in Japan, implications of independent support. This is the topic of my talk today. In 2013, the Livelihood Protection Law, which is Japan's primary scheme of public assistance, similar to EHESS, le Revenu de Solidarité Active here, this system was drastically revised for the first time after it had been enacted in 1950. And at the same time, the new Services and Supports for People in Need Act was passed as the secondary safety net. It came into force in 2015. Over 60 years have passed since the current public assistance law was enacted in 1950. And during that time, various social, political, and economic conditions have largely changed, and the law has been under pressure to keep pace with these changing conditions. Therefore, it can be said that revision of the law itself was necessary. Now, a question to be considered is the direction of the reforms. The purpose of this presentation is to clarify the implications of these reforms, which is proceeding under the keyword of independent support. And the outline of the presentation is as follows. First, the neoliberal reforms of welfare and its development in Japan in general will be discussed. And second, the neoliberal reforms of anti-poverty policies specifically will be discussed. And finally, the implications, I will examine the implications of these reforms. What is neoliberalism? Now, what is neoliberalism? In order to understand the characteristics of neoliberal reforms of welfare better, I would like to refer here to the argument by Jamie Peck and Adam Tickle. Peck and Tickle distinguish two phases of neoliberalism. That is rollback neoliberalism and rollout neoliberalism. In rollback neoliberalism, the state is oriented towards withdrawal from the market and smaller government. Here, freedom of enterprise actively, and to this end, deregulation and privatization are the keys. An example of this would be the Thatcher government of the 1980s in the UK. In contrast, in roll-out neoliberalism, the state plays a rather active role in maximizing market freedom and utilizing civil society. Here, it is important for citizens to become active and participate in welfare society, and sometimes citizens are expected to contribute as a provider of welfare services. An example of this would be Blair's New Labour on the 1990s, the third way in the UK. Let me use this framework by Peck and Tickle to explain the neoliberal welfare reforms in Japan. In Japan, as in many other welfare states, rollback-type welfare reforms proceeded in the 1980s. Through deregulation, privatization, and decentralization, the role of the market economy in welfare rose. Here, it is important to note that, unlike the European welfare states, including France, traditionally in Japan, while people's lives have been highly dependent on mutual support between family members, lifetime employment, and generous welfare programs in the corporations. State welfare has not been fully developed, and the level of state welfare is relatively low to begin with, even before rollback reforms. Next, in the 1990s, the state entered a phase in which it actively utilized civil society. The government began to seek the reform of the basic welfare structure, and quasi-markets were introduced into welfare policy in the name of a new public and citizen participation was encouraged. The key phrase used in this process was independent support. In 2000, the social welfare law, this is like the basic law of social welfare, was amended, where it was clearly stated for the first time that the purpose of welfare policy was not to protect the vulnerable or meet the needs, but to support independence. In the short time that followed, independent support scheme was rapidly introduced and expanded in all areas of welfare policies in Japan. For example, policies for homeless people or lone parent households, the disabled, etc. And the area where this independent support reform took place most intensively was anti-poverty policies. So let me explain this next. In Japan, the increase in the number of the poor and the welfare recipients has become a social issue since the 2000s. The Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare has also embarked on reforms in response to this issue. Before going into a description of these reforms, 2 points should be noted here. First, the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare's administrative document was concerned with the increase in the number of welfare recipients, not the increase in the number of the poor. In other words, the aim of the reform was not to tackle the issue of poverty itself, but to curb public assistance from the outset. Second, shortly before the reforms, the various problems surrounding public assistance had been widely reported in the media, mainly in the form of bashing. And these are mostly myths with no basis in reality. However, the current reforms were made in a way that reflect or act upon these myths. So I would like to start seeing myth discourses on public assistance in the media. 5 myths on public assistance. The first myth is that the number of people using public assistance is rapidly increasing. And in fact, there are over 2 million recipients today, while this is the highest number since the system was established, considering the fact that the population of Japan is now 150% of what it was when the system was established. The ratio of public assistance usage is actually not the highest it has ever been. For example, in 1951, the ratio was 2.42% compared with 1.64% in 2020. The second myth is related to the first. This is that public assistance is straining the national budget. However, as a ratio of the general account budget in Japan, public assistance costs are no greater than 0.4%. It's 0.36%, sorry. They don't even account for 1% of the national budget. The third myth is that lazy people who are capable of working but not trying to find work are receiving public assistance. However, about 80% of the recipients are elderly or disabled. Actually, the majority of recipients are those who cannot work in Japan. The fourth myth is that recipients are abusing public assistance. This myth has been reinforced by sensational media reports of recipients spending all of their welfare money on gambling, alcohol, and etc. In reality, such recipients are only a small percentage of the total, and in the first place, receiving public assistance is a social right of citizens, and how they spend their money is their freedom and should not be monitored or controlled. The fifth myth is that fraudulent receipt of public assistance is running rampant. However, the percentage of the fraudulent receipt is no greater than 0.5%, not even accounting for 1%. Also, among such fraudulent receipt, most of them are minor infractions, such as failing to report a high school student's income from a part-time job, around a few €100 a month. As I mentioned earlier, it is important to keep in mind that these myths and bashing have been used to carry out the reforms. Before I will go into the details of reforms, let me explain briefly here in which direction the reforms were made. The revisions made in response to the first myth concerning a rapid increase in recipients and the second myth concerning strain on the national budget is an overall decrease in the level of public assistance provided. In response to the third myth concerning work avoidance, being lazy, strengthening of work incentives measures which can be recognized as workfare schemes were enforced. In response to the fourth myth concerning abuse of welfare, controlling and monitoring of behavior of public assistance recipients were strengthened. And in response to the fifth myth concerning fraudulent receipt, countermeasures to combat it were strengthened. I will focus on the three turning points that symbolize and represent the neoliberal reforms of anti-poverty policies in Japan and look at each of them in details. First one is a relatively minor revision of the livelihood protection law in 2005. And the second one is a drastic revision of the same law in 2013. The third one is the enactment of Services and Supports for People in Need Act in 2013. Let me explain in turn. A minor yet significant revision of the livelihood protection law in 2005. In 2005, for the first time, the independent support program was introduced into livelihood protection law. As I explained earlier, this is Japan's primary scheme of public assistance. Here, the central objective of public assistance was totally changed from guaranteeing minimum standard of living by economic benefits to independent support. The fact that at the same time as the introduction of the program, part of the economic benefits, which are additional payments for lone parent households and for the elderly, these benefits were abolished. This is a good symbol of this shift. Under this scheme, independence has been segmented into three categories: financial independence, independence of everyday life, and independence of social life. And support programs for each of these have been introduced. Financial independence means here financial independence through employment, or more specifically, getting out of welfare or getting out of dependency on welfare. In contrast, independence of everyday life means restoring and maintaining physical and mental health and leading an independent life in everyday life, such as managing one's own health and lifestyle, while independence of social life means restoring and maintaining social ties and leading a fulfilling life as a member of the local community. So traditionally, independence in the context of public assistance meant financial independence, like getting out of welfare dependency. Therefore, social workers have been expected to focus on support for employment, like paid work. And many researchers, including myself, have criticized this narrowly defined view of independence and the scheme of support as being work-first or workfare model. In this sense, the introduction of this program and diversification of independence may seem at first glance to be desirable, in that it does not focus solely on employment or paid work. And actually, many researchers have positively evaluated the program, as this can provide empowerment and recognition of welfare recipients instead of forcing them into work against their will. However, this means that the power of social workers is not limited to the area of employment, but permeates all areas of life, including everyday life and social life, under the name of independent support. So in this presentation, I would rather critically examine the policy implications of the diversification and expansion of the scope of independence. The second is the drastic revision of the livelihood protection law in 2013, which is of great significance in the history of Japan's anti-poverty policy. This is because the livelihood protection law has remained unchanged for more than 60 years since it was enacted in 1950 after the World War II. It is the only social security law in Japan that has not been amended for such a long period of time. Anyhow, the law was fundamentally amended in 2013 for the first time. And this reform includes decrease in public assistance levels and strengthening of independent support measures and enhancement countermeasures to combat fraudulent receipt. So, decrease in public assistance levels. In this revision, public assistance levels have been reduced by 10% incrementally. This is the biggest cut in welfare spending, reduction of economic benefits, throughout the history of Japan's public assistance system. And this reduction has had greater impact on the lives of recipients. In fact, lots of recipients from all over the country took the government to court for violating the Constitution and the right to life, which is stipulated in Article 25 of the Constitution in Japan. And second, strengthening of independent support measures. This includes two of the followings. First, programs aimed at strengthening of work incentives of welfare recipients for financial independence have been introduced. And second, personal support programs for independence of everyday life have been introduced. I will explain the details of these programs shortly. Third, enforcement countermeasures to combat fraudulent receipt. Let me explain these in turn. Decrease in public assistance levels. There are two aspects to public assistance levels, a practical aspect and a normative aspect. The practical aspect relates to the determination of the actual amount of benefit given to the recipients. And it is very important as it influences the standard of living of the recipients directly, and it also influences several social security benefits. And the normative aspect relates to the minimum living standards that nation should guarantee its citizens, namely the national minimum. As I mentioned earlier, in the current revision, the decision was made to incrementally reduce public assistance levels by 10%. The rhetoric behind that decision is referred to as the balance argument. Essentially, this argument contrasts public assistance levels with the incomes of the working poor people, or the amount of the basic pension, and justifies lowering public assistance levels on the basis that welfare payments are higher than the incomes of the poorest workers, in order to bring about a relative balance. It is interesting that even the counter-arguments against the reduced public assistance levels are grounded in the logic of the balance argument. Essentially, it is that the income of the working poor or the amount of basic pension should be raised because they are lower than public assistance levels, national minimum. Although this is certainly a valid point to make, this excessive focus on the balance moves attention away from the normative aspect that the minimum living standards guaranteed by the nation for its citizens have in fact declined. As I said earlier, in order to promote financial independence, several measures targeting to strengthening of work incentives of welfare recipients were introduced. For example, intensive employment counseling program to quickly get recipients out of public assistance, urging recipients to work at least a small number of hours at lower age, etc. However, considering that the majority of Japan's public assistance recipients are those who cannot work, comprised of the elderly or the disabled, it raises the question just how effective this kind of workfare or work-first program will be. Also, in practice, the strengthening of work incentives comes dangerously close to forcing people to work for a suggested minimum of hours at the minimum wage. This strong urging of recipients to be independent through work will have a restrictive effect on public assistance as a whole. Next. Support of personal finance and health management. In order to promote independence of everyday life, on the one hand, the revision makes it clear that being healthy or managing personal finances are now a matter of personal responsibility of the welfare recipients. On the other hand, it also offers personal support to those who have difficulty taking care of their health or managing their personal finances by themselves. It should be noted here that at the same time as this support was introduced, the investigative powers of welfare offices were greatly expanded, allowing them to penetrate into the very private sphere of the individual recipients. The welfare offices are now empowered to monitor and control recipients' lives in detail, such as whether they are buying unnecessary items or eating unhealthy food. The increase of the welfare office's power is inextricably linked to the decrease of the power of recipients. In general, it can be said that the responsibilities of recipients have been increased while their rights and freedom have been decreased. Anyhow, in this way, the management of health and personal finance has become a matter of personal responsibility in principle. But at the same time, it has become easier for the welfare offices to control the health and personal finances of recipients under the pretext of support. So you can say that this is nothing more than an invasion of personal privacy. The public assistance recipients cannot exercise their right to do things that are not particularly good for them, while ordinary citizens may exercise the right. For example, occasional drinking and smoking despite knowing it is unhealthy, or buying a cake despite knowing it is wasteful to do so. In other words, this enhanced controlling is, in reality, a restriction on how to use money or deprivation of freedom. Enforcement countermeasures to combat fraudulent receipt. This is mainly comprised of two reforms. First one, strengthening the authority and power of welfare offices. Here too, the power and authority of welfare offices was strengthened. Specifically, this is an enhancement of the power of caseworkers, social workers to investigate and instruct recipients. And toughening punishment. Also, the punishment for fraudulent receipt of public assistance was increased from up to 3 years imprisonment or a fine of 300,000 Japanese yen, which is 2,110 euro or less, to up to 3 years imprisonment or a fine of 1 million Japanese yen, which is 7,034 euro or less. Here, we must be cautious of the flip side of strengthening the authority and power of the welfare office. This is a corresponding weakening of the power of the recipients. Also, as the word punishment itself makes it clear, the public assistance is becoming more punishment-oriented. Now, I will talk about the last and the third symbolic neoliberal reforms of anti-poverty policies in Japan. Enactment of Services and Supports for People in Need Act. In fact, in 2013, Services and Supports for People in Need Act was passed at the same time as the revision of Livelihood Protection Act, and this act can be called the culmination of the institutionalization of independent support. This is positioned as a secondary safety net to ensure that people in need do not fall into welfare and provides various programs for independent support. The features of the scheme can be summarized as follows. First, it doesn't provide financial benefits in general, but personal support to people. There are various programs for supporting people according to their needs and circumstances, like monetary management support, learning support for children in low-income families, advice and training for job seekers, support for the homelessness, etc. Second, additionally, social workers apply a staying close beside approach. This means they try to keep positive relationship patiently with people and empower them rather than a work-first approach. And the third, support is provided by the private and third sectors rather than the public sector. So now, let me discuss the policy implications underlying these series of neoliberal reforms of anti-poverty policies in Japan. Those are decentralization and diversification of independence and the expansion of independent support and individualization and focusing on individuals' behavior. And this actually brings othering and stigmatization of the public assistance recipients. And finally, a shift from redistribution to recognition. Let's go through them in order. First, decentralization. The expansion of independent support goes hand in hand with decentralization, which is increasing the discretion and power of local authorities and welfare offices, while at the same time, private organizations are becoming key providers of the support. This has often been regarded as a positive contrast to the traditional paternalistic and uniform welfare provision by the government, as it enables to provide non-paternalistic and various type of welfare services according to recipients' needs or choices of individuals. On the other hand, it is sometimes pointed out that this pluralization and decentralization of the providers leads to a reduction of public responsibility or like state responsibility. It should be noted here that this does not necessarily mean that state discretion power has been curtailed. On the contrary, the state has been increasing its control over these private organizations, making it more difficult for organizations which are not obedient to the government to survive. What is important here is that independent support scheme has not contributed to tackling the issue of poverty, but rather to the emergence of the independent support industry, where private organizations play a major role. The money goes to the support providers as subsidies, not to the people in need. In fact, the poverty rate in Japan has not changed that much after the introduction of independent support scheme. Specifically, the poverty rate in 2000 was 15.3%, and that in 2018 was 15.4%. Ironically, it is even as if the poor are functionally needed here to establish this new industry. Second, diversification of independence and the expansion of independent support. The independent support type reforms have diversified the meaning of independence and expanded support accordingly. As discussed above, this has been regarded positively as providing empowerment and recognition to the poor, in contrast to the traditional work-first approach. But it also means, on the other hand, that the poor are increasingly required to be independent not only in the field of employment, but also in their lives, daily lives and social life. Ironically, the more independent support is extended, the more the responsibility of those who cannot or those who are deemed not to be independent will be emphasized. As if to say, we've provided this much, various kinds of support to you, so if you still cannot be independent, then that's your responsibility now. So here, support could become an alibi or excuse for the government to evade their responsibility and instead to emphasize the self or personal responsibility of the poor themselves. Then individualization, focus on behavior. So third, the focus of independent support is on the individuals and in particular their behavior. This is because staying close beside approach aims to change the behavior of the poor according to their individuality. This attitude will, of course, contribute to individualizing the problem and overlooking the social or structural problems that create poverty. More importantly, however, the focus on individual behavior can have an othering effect. The act of independent support can, in a primary sense, recast the only economically impoverished poor as those who have some challenges towards independence in daily life or social life and who therefore need support. More specifically, it regards specific behaviors as undesirable and try to bring them closer to what is considered as desirable through support while differentiating them from desirable behaviors. This can be considered as othering. So Jok Young distinguishes between two modes of othering, conservative and liberal othering. Conservative othering is an approach that demonizes the poor, for example, regarding them as criminals, and emphasizes punitive or exclusionary policies. It can be described as simple and straightforward othering. On the other hand, more complex is liberal othering. It does not demonize or straightforwardly exclude the poor, and therefore it is very common yet rarely recognized. It provides education or support to the poor to change their behaviors to participate in or fit in society. The point here is that in both cases, the objective is to change behavior of the recipient. You could say that the series of reforms in public assistance in Japan have had a mixture of these two different types of othering functions. Let me explain in turn. So, restricting or monitoring behavior. This is a case of conservative othering. As you can see, especially in the support of personal finance and health management, the behavior of the welfare recipients has become the focus now. This trend can be seen also in local governments. Let me mention a few outrageous cases. For example, in city of Kyoto, a single mother who applied for public assistance was forbidden from living with a man and made to sign a contract cutting her off from public assistance if she gets pregnant. The city of Yokohama passed an ordinance that denies applications for public assistance to those who act rudely on the grounds that they are suspected of being a member of organized crime groups. And the city of Ono passed an ordinance that obligates citizens to report any recipients to the city if they are discovered gambling on pachinko or horse racing. The city of Saitama has established a reporting hotline for citizens to notify the government if they suspect recipients of misrepresenting the size of their family or hiding their ownership of a vehicle in order to improperly receive public assistance. What is important here is that public assistance recipients are the only ones having their behavior strictly questioned and monitored and restricted. And the monitoring of welfare recipients is now becoming the duty not only of social workers but also of ordinary citizens. This can be one big step for a surveillance society. And next, independent support, a case of liberal othering. Liberal othering focuses on support and education rather than just excluding the poor. It is characteristic of roll-out neoliberalism, and it is also typical of the independent support policy schemes in Japan. Independent support has been introduced to change behavior of the public assistance recipients or the poor through a staying close beside approach. Overall, independent support contributes to maintain and strengthen social orders rather than to help the poor themselves by othering. The stigmatization of recipients. In addition to restricting and monitoring behavior and erosion of rights that we just examined, the strong urging of recipients to work even for a minimum wage is simply called less eligibility policy. This continuous deprivation of the rights as citizens effectively turns public assistance recipients into second-class citizens. And this trend is exacerbated by the punitive character of public assistance. It can even criminalize the recipients. In fact, this viewpoint has resulted in retired police officers being posted at many welfare offices in Japan now. Lastly, let us look at this from redistribution to recognition. The independent support type reforms of anti-poverty policies must not be understood as a mere quantitative transformation, such as the reduction of benefits, but rather as a qualitative transformation. It represents a qualitative shift in the focus of anti-poverty policy from guaranteeing minimum standard of living by economic benefits to independent support. In other words, from redistribution to recognition. What is important here is that, as Nancy Fraser once pointed out, a trade-off between redistribution and recognition has occurred at this turning point. While independent support, which is oriented towards recognition of the poor, is expanding, redistribution, which is supposed to have a primary effect on the elimination of poverty, this redistribution continues to shrink. It is as if the independent support is functioning as a constructive device of recognition to camouflage the reduction in redistribution. So finally, let me conclude my presentation. Up to this point, we have examined the implication of the neoliberal reforms of anti-poverty policies in Japan. Japan's public assistance is being restricted through the decrease in its level and the stigmatization of its recipients. However, this is not only a restriction. It is a proxy for weakening the duty of the state to guarantee minimum standard of living for citizens, which it achieves through decentralization and the expansion of the personal responsibility. Furthermore, public assistance recipients are turned into second-class citizens and in some cases criminalized. This punitive approach has led to increased controlling and monitoring behavior of the poor through cooperation between welfare agencies and the police agencies. It is important to note that while the state's role in providing welfare is shrinking, on the other hand, its role in controlling and regulating the poor is expanding. Loic Vacan has called this a shift from a welfare state to a prison state. In a prison state, it is said that a drug net is used to compensate for the holes in the safety net, so that it has contributed to the creation of a surveillance society. Japan's public assistance system is now also set on such a course. What is required to resist this trend is very simple, I guess. We need to reconsider the state's role, especially the role in providing welfare, as we say, redistribution. Thank you.